Hello, everybody, and welcome to a very special edition of whatever this is. It's not really Handmade Hero. It's just kind of like a thing on the Molly Rocket channel that's pretty important to me, and I wanted to share it with you folks because I have a feeling that some of my viewers are probably from the same generation I am. And for those of you who aren't, for a younger generation, this might be an interesting thing just to see. As I've mentioned recently, and you may have joined me for doing this, I played it on stream actually. I recently, for the first time, played the classic Infocom game Trinity by Professor Brian Moriarty. And I was really shocked, and you saw it on stream when I played, just how shocked I was at like how good this game was. I had played many Infocom games. My childhood actually was spent playing Infocom games, and I had never played that one because it was a relatively late release. It was 1986, and most of the Infocoms I played were like probably 82, 3, 4, or something like that. Games that had been out by then. And I was totally amazed by this game because it's one of the most brilliantly created games that I've played. It was much more interesting and much more like of a rich experience, and it was doing things that I almost never see any games do. The way that it worked with imagery was just striking, and even today when especially indie games, maybe not AAA games, but indie games are falling all over themselves to be trying to be deep and meaningful, even kind of crossing the line into pretentious a lot of the times. People have very little ability to actually pull this off. And here I am playing a game from, 30 years ago, and it was doing all of this stuff. It's just remarkable. It's a game where every little thing you might look at, there's deeper meaning to it and more connection to the rest of the game. Things you wouldn't even think of, because if you're used to just playing games, you're not used to this level of complexity. You're not used to the locations in the game also meaning something to the theme of the game, meaning something to the imagery in the game. Every last little thing in Trinity is just remarkably literarily on point. And I was just amazed by this. So what I wanted to do today is share with you a very special thing that I received. This is an original Macintosh edition of Trinity in the original box, signed by Brian Moriarty to me. The professor himself actually sent me this. And the reason for this is, and I'm going to unbox this for you because I wanted to do it on stream so everyone could see. The reason he sent me this is even more exciting, and there's a little bit of a bummer to it, but mostly it's just awesome, which is that Brian also agreed to do a complete interview series with me where we talk about the creation of this game and his life leading up to it, which we did together already. It's already recorded. The only bummer is the recording was done remotely, and one of the sessions was the audio wasn't quite lost, but the only copy of the audio we have is really bad because Brian was recording on his side and I was recording on my side, and his recording side didn't quite work. And so we're trying right now to restore that audio to reasonable quality, but it's an absolutely amazing interview. It's one of the most revelatory interviews I've ever done. I absolutely loved it. It has so much stuff in it about his life and what brought him to the point of doing Trinity and why, what it was like in the old days, what Infocom was like, and how the development process went. There were things in there that I realized about Infocom that not only had I never realized, but all of the histories of Infocom seemed to miss. Really interesting, cool stuff. And it's It's a big, like, 10-hour interview series, and I'm going to be releasing it in parts as I'm able to kind of, like, restore the parts that were a little bit busted and then edit it together for the best quality that I can manage. So, as a thank you for that, he didn't have to do this because it was my pleasure, but he sent me this original boxed edition, and he asked me, he said, would you like one in shrink wrap, which is probably worth a lot more, or would you like one not in shrink wrap? And I didn't even hesitate. I was like, not in shrink wrap, please, because if you sent me one in shrink wrap, I'm just going to open it, right? And then I wouldn't have the signature anymore because the signature would be on the outside. So I'm like, I don't care how much it's worth because I'm never selling it. So please send me one that's signed on the actual box, because I will display this, but I want to be able to open it because, I want to look at what was inside. And so I'm really excited about this, and here is the original box copy. It's in great shape, and it's a Macintosh edition. You can see right here, it says on the thing, I'll try to hold this up to the camera, requires 512K of memory. And for those of you who don't know, this is a little bit of the sort of backstory of Infocom, right? This was right at the time Trinity was one of the first titles that was released using the new expanded memory footprint of 256K. It required 256K computers to run it. And the Macintosh, I would assume, probably required extra, not just 256K, because it had a whole operating system running, right? Like most of the other micros at the time would just kind of have this limited BIOS thing running. But probably they needed 512K because the OS was probably like the Macintosh graphical operating system would have been running at the time, right, when you were running Trinity. So this requires 512K. Other computers with only 256K could run Trinity, such as the Commodore. Well, actually, you know what? That's a lie, what I'm saying. It's actually only 128K that they needed. It's 256K footprint. So the disk had to be able to support that, I believe. But it's actually only 128K that you needed because like a Commodore 128 could run it. So it paged it in, right? So I'm imagining this 512K is only that way because the Macintosh needed it, right? And that would be interesting to know why it was 512K exactly. Because I don't actually know what the Macintosh's memory footprints were exactly. But yeah, just so you know, that's why it's such a an interesting kind of like old thing. Yeah, can you imagine 100? Like imagine nowadays people saying, well, you need at least 128K to run this, or 512K in this point. So yeah, earlier Infocom games could run in less, so they could run in 64K, 48K as well, I believe. They would run in less because they had smaller simultaneously addressable regions. So Apple IIs, Commodore 64s, obviously Commodore 64 is only 64K. They could run earlier Infocom games, and the way that worked was they would page, in and out a bigger footprint, which I think was 128K of actual data that would page in and out. This for Trinity, and I think also for Mind Forever Voyaging and some of the newer games that were coming out around this time, Infocom upgraded their Z machine, their virtual machine format, which is how these games work. They had like basically a virtual little assembly language thing, a machine code that they would compile their games to, and then there would just be interpreters written for each machine. It went from 128K base footprint on storage to 256K base footprint, which was, it was compressed, obviously, but using kind of primitive compression at the time, but it's what you could do reasonably with tech of the time. And so that's, this was one of the first bigger games. And boy, was it bigger. Trinity is much larger than a typical Infocom game was prior to this point, specifically because it could use the new expanded format, and so it could be larger and have more text and more rooms than earlier titles did. For example, and again, I'm just kind of blabbering here because that's the whole point of this stream. Earlier Infocom games like Zork, originally Zork was one big game. It was called Dungeon, and it ran as one continuous thing that had all Zork 1, 2, and 3 sort of placed in it. And there are some parts that were added for Zork 1, 2, and 3 specifically that weren't in the original dungeon. But otherwise, it was this one big thing. And when they went to ship it on microcomputers, they couldn't do that. So they had to actually break it up into multiple pieces because it was simply too big to ship. They didn't have, maybe through some other Herculean means, they could have made it work by, I don't know, maybe if they had access to modern compression ideas, but those may have been too slow, to run on older computers anyway. So who knows if it would even have been possible. So they just broke it up into 3 pieces, added some stuff to make them self-contained experiences, and thus the original dungeon, which was the whole thing, became 3 separate Zorks that you had to play separately, right? All right, so anyway, let's take a look at this box. Let's take a look at all the different parts of it. So you can see down at the bottom here, you've got the standard Infocom stuff. And on here, you can see you've got like, let me try to put that into frame here. I'm not good at this because I'm not an unboxing person. You can see on here, you've got Interactive Fiction Plus, you've got Fantasy, and you've got Standard Level. And what those are is Interactive Fiction Plus was basically the thing I was just talking about. It was that idea that these were going to be bigger now. They expanded that footprint. So that's the upgraded Z machine that it's talking about. The fantasy part is just they tried to categorize their games as like sci-fi or whatever. They tried to kind of say, well, much like literature, we're going to categorize what games we ship. So we, when you're buying a game from us, if you want sci-fi, you buy sci-fi. If you want fantasy, you get fantasy. This is classified as fantasy. Now, really, when you play Trinity, honestly, if you were using a literary categorization, I would not categorize it as fantasy. I would actually categorize it as magical realism. It feels a lot more to me like a Kurt Vonnegut novel, or a kind of classic, a classic magical realist whose names are escaping me now because I'm, of course, on stream and can't think of them, and also I'm not a literary critic, so my the names of books are rusty. But in general, like, the Infinite Library, that kind of thing. This is not really fantasy. It's not like orcs and elves and things. There is a fantastical element to it, but it's much more about magical realism. It's like, to me, it's much more about like looking at the real world through a lens that allows fantastical things. And that's, I think, an important distinction between it and, say, something like Zork, which is pure fantasy. Standard level was a difficulty categorization. These difficulty categorizations never really made any sense. They would categorize things like suspended, I think, probably as advanced, maybe, I hope, because it's incredibly difficult. So some games that were very difficult, I think, got a level above standard. But honestly, all Infocom games, even Trinity to a slight extent, although honestly, Trinity's pretty good about this, especially for the time, were they suffered from the arbitrary, like, fact that puzzle mechanics about having puzzles with a single solution are generally just kind of arbitrary to solve. That's just kind of a thing about adventure games. And Trinity does a really nice job of kind of avoiding that as much as possible. But, calling something standard level in general versus advanced, they're all just kind of, you have to be able to solve adventure game style puzzles. And if you can get through a lot of these games. If you can't, you're going to need a hint book. That's just kind of how it works. So their attempts to categorize these, I don't think, worked very well. They did try to ship some beginner games, but honestly, they're just not that much easier sometimes. I mean, sometimes they are, but some of the ones they called beginner just weren't really all that much easier, to be completely honest. So on the back of the box, well, we can look at the spines as well. You can see they're pretty standard. They just kind of repeat the information. Again, there's nothing particularly interesting on the spine. On the back, you've got sort of the description of the game and, a much more detailed textual description than you would often get on a game today, where they're just like, buy this game, it's got God of War in it or whatever, right? And one of the most interesting things is that right at the top, it's got a quote from Hamlet, right? Right at the top, it's got a quote from Hamlet. How many video games start the back of the box blurb with a quote from Hamlet right there at the top, right? And that's notable for multiple reasons. One big reason is because this is the first game and Brian Moriarty is the person who invented the quote box. So Infocom Games never had the concept of a quote box. Brian Moriarty, the professor himself, invented the quote box. As you will hear in the interview, I go into detail about that because I was very interested and I wanted to know if he was the one who made this happen, because when he first got hired at Infocom, he was the one who was hired to do ports of the new sort of screen positioning stuff that they needed to do on the microcomputer. So he wasn't hired as a game designer. Brian Moriarty was originally hired at Infocom as someone who worked on their interpreters. So he worked on like the Commodore 64 and the Atari and the Apple, those kinds of computers. He was specifically an Atari 400 and 800 specialist. His previous job was at Analog Magazine, the premier Atari magazine of the day. And he had worked on the Atari, making, the code that came with those magazines. In those days, magazines came with code and utilities and stuff. And that was one of the big things he did there. He also was like, did editorials and he did articles. He did a lot of stuff at Analog Magazine, so he was kind of an Atari expert, and he got hired to do microcomputer stuff. And so one of the first things he did when he worked at Infocom, he wasn't working on games. He was working on their interpreter layer that ran the games. And so he knew what it could do, and he knew like the new things that would be possible because he was enabling those things that were supposed to happen. And because they had recently done a game called Sea Stalker, which had a little map printout, and he had done some stuff to enable that on the new micros. And so for Trinity, he came up with this idea that there would be these boxes that would pop up as you were playing that would have quotes from famous literature that would tie into what you were doing in the game. And it's a really great effect. And it was totally new at the time. And so right on the back of the box, you can see that like it's got a Hamlet in there. That's going to be something that happens in the game all the time. And it's a really cool thing that you can actually do to try to figure out what those quotes have to do with the game, because they're all actually pretty deeply integrated into it. And Brian, during the interview, told me, as you'll find out when we get it released, he told me that he had been saving up quotes for quite some time during the development of the game to get the right ones in there and have ones that he thought were good and meaningful. So let me try and zoom in on the picture here. You can find these scanned online. If I'm not holding it very well, you can find some people have scanned these in. But you can see on the back here, there's a bunch of mushrooms laid out with the game materials. There's a paper crane there. There's the little sundial you can see in front of the main mushroom. There's the game disc, the not gatefold sleeve, the booklet sleeve, which we'll look at in a second. And I'll show you some of those things. Then there's these mushrooms. The mushrooms in Trinity play a very significant role. In a very specific way, they are sort of an allusion to Alice in Wonderland, but they're actually much more than that, and I don't want to spoiler the game for you if you haven't already played it. There's a very specific meaning to the mushrooms, and there's a very deep meaning to the mushrooms that actually it's really pretty breathtaking when I first noticed it. Certain places in the game that you can observe, that's sort of like a mushroom forest that you're in. And it's really kind of striking. I know that's a weird thing to say about mushrooms, but trust me, if you actually are the kind of person who likes literature, who likes sort of meaningful literature, and you play Trinity and really pay attention to what it says, there are some incredible moments that are just when you realize what things mean and what they mean for humanity. It's just really kind of striking. So why I said this is one of the most amazing games I ever played, because I'd never seen anything like this. You almost never see anything like this today, but I certainly never saw anything like this in the 80s. No one was thinking along these lines at all, not even close. So that's what's on the back. On the front, you can see sort of the main elements of Trinity juxtaposed. It is a mushroom cloud. Spoiler alert, although you will find this out in the first few minutes of the game, so it's not really a spoiler. Trinity is about atomic weapons. It's about the power of atomic weapons and what it means to have them, to make them. What are the costs? What are the benefits? What does it mean to society? The entire game is pretty much about that. and it looks at it in many very interesting ways, very surprising ways. There's a lot of things in there that you wouldn't think are connected, but if you think about it a little more, you realize, oh wait, no, that makes perfect sense why that's there. And in front of the the mushroom cloud, you can see a sundial. And the sundial is the central sort of landmark of Trinity. It's the thing that ties everything together. And it's really remarkable how this works. The entire game of Trinity kind of revolves around this sundial. And there's a lot of meaning. There's a reason why that's true. Because the idea of how, the atomic bomb and when it was originally made and what happened subsequent to that, there's a lot to be said about time, like what happens as time progresses from when you first realize you can harness the power of a sun for a destructive end. What proceeds from that? And the time going forward and backward to go backwards in time to think about what that means is a big part of the game and the meaning of the game. And the sundial is what ties all that together. So you see that really like prominently portrayed on the cover of Trinity. Now here's the thing I had to clarify with the professor. I actually emailed him because this is just how bad my memory is. I didn't remember whether this was true of most Infocom games or not. You'll notice that it actually has an openable front that opens into a comic book. And the comic book then turns into the manual, right? So it's got two pieces in the front. See that? So the actual game is then behind a plastic piece here that's at the end of the manual part. Right? Now, I had to ask because I was like, gosh, I can't remember. Is that specific to Trinity? Or was that true of most Infocom games? Like, I had some of these games as a child. My dad would buy them for the computer we had at home when I was very little. I was like 5 years old or something, 6 years old, right? I was really young. And they would buy these games, and we had a few of them. We had Starcross, which I know was different because it came in a UFO-shaped container, which I remember. So it didn't have that. But then Cutthroats and Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy were two other ones that we had, as well as the 3 Zorks. And I don't know if we had any others, but those were the ones I remember. I played many more Infocom games later when I bought a copy of The Lost Treasures of Infocom, which was a collection released when I was like in high school or something. And that was a great way for me to play a ton of the games that I didn't have as a child. So there was a bunch that I have played that we didn't have those original boxes for because I just had a big box that had them all in it. That was like a thing that Activision released as sort of a half-hearted attempt to do a reissue. They've never done a proper reissue of the Infocom games. I've actually contacted them about whether or not that'd be something they would let me do, and they couldn't really figure out a way to let me do it. So, oh well. But if you look at the way this works, Brian actually said this is how most of them were. He said, no, they were this way. So Cutthroats probably was this way, and I probably just can't remember because I couldn't remember. I just couldn't remember how it was. So this was pretty common, and he told me a little tidbit that's not in the interview because I hadn't received the box time, so I didn't think to ask. What he said was that Infocom actually had changed the way they did their packaging, and the packaging was going to be shrink-wrapped. This part would be shrink-wrapped, but this part would be available. And the reason for that was they wanted people in the store to be able to take the box and read through the promotional part here, or it's not really necessarily promotional, but like supplemental stuff, to get a feel for the game so they could kind of be more interested perhaps in buying it. And so that was why they originally did this special folding sleeve. But apparently retailers didn't like that because this part would get damaged or something, and customers didn't like that. They wanted the whole thing in shrink. So then they switched to they kept it, but that was why this is like this instead of a booklet that comes in there. They just kept the way they were doing it because they'd already done it that way, but then shrink wrapped the whole thing. So this whole thing would have been shrink wrapped when you bought Trinity, but they kept this idea of having the outer piece because that was sort of a marketing idea that sort of failed because retailers didn't like it. The shrink wrapping the inside. Okay. So on the inside cover, there's a list of quotes. This was typical for Infocom games at the time. I remember this. I remember reading the ones for Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy were comedy ones. For example, they were fictional quotes that didn't actually exist. These are real quotes, and they're just quotes talking about how Infocom games are cool. That was really all they were. I don't even think any of these are specific to Trinity. I'm not sure. Let me take a quick look, but I don't think so. Yeah, I mean, they're not specific to Trinity. They're just like basically Infocom marketing blurbs. You then have the illustrated story of the atomic bomb, and this is a comic book. Now, one of the things that you will realize if you listen to the interview carefully when I get those up, Brian was super, super into the idea of stuff coming in the box. And there's a really great reason for that, as you'll hear him tell it. He loved buying games at the store. He, as a consumer, as a person who was just as a fan, who liked Infocom and bought the games before he worked there, when he was just a dude living on his own with a computer, and he would go buy a game to play it, he loved having the box be a thing that was cool and had stuff in it. And as you'll see, there's things inside Infocom games. There are always these things called feelies, which are things that you actually get that you can touch, tangible items. They're the kinds of things that nowadays you would pay hundreds of dollars for by buying the God of War Ultimate Hammer Edition or whatever stupid thing they're selling, where you pay like $150 or whatever to get this big weird case, or $200. I don't know how much it costs. It's a tremendous amount of money. You get this big weird case with little like figurines in it or something like that. Infocom just used to give you that stuff for the price of admission. And Brian actually remembered this as a person who purchased games and really enjoyed that part. So when he made games at Infocom, his first game was Wishbringer, which is the game he made prior to this. Then he made Trinity subsequently. Both times, in Wishbringer and in Trinity, he started the game always with the idea in mind that he wanted a cool experience for just opening the box. Like, he wanted things in there to not just be some random crap that you thought of after the fact to try and make the game feel more interesting by putting the box. He wanted them to be things that featured prominently in the game, so he actually considered both aspects of this in the design. The design of what's in the game included designing what would be in the box, and he thought of those as like the same thing, not some separate idea where you design a game first and then figure out what goes in the box. And so if you look through kind of all the stuff that's in here, the illustrated story of the atomic bomb is the first thing. It's this cool comic book that Brian had made to go with the game, and it sort of tells the backstory of creating the atomic bomb, which is not actually, and I think this is what, again, is so important and so interesting about a game like Trinity, it's not required to play the game. It's not like you need this backstory or something. It's just another perspective on the things the game is talking about. It's another way of adding depth and connection to what you see in the game. And it tells the backstory of how the U.S. went about creating an atomic bomb program and how it was spied on by the Russians, and how they got the atomic bomb secrets from it. And in this, if you pay attention, there are symbols. You can see those there. Those symbols are very important, and where they occur in this comic book corresponds to what they actually mean and how they play out in the game. And so it's a really interesting first piece of stuff that's in the manual to look at. Now, this was a really interesting aspect. This is a case of sort of Brian working with marketing. He originally, I believe, just wanted this shot of Trinity's site, which I want to say he took himself. I believe this is a photograph he took. Because he visited all of these places before he wrote the game. He went to the Los Alamos Museum, he went to Trinity's site, and he saw the ranch there that features later in the game. This is a shot that's very meaningful to him, and I believe he took it himself. And they didn't want just a picture of that. I believe in the interview he says exactly what it is. So, you know what, I'll let him explain it better. But this quote, I believe he went and looked for a quote to put there because I think marketing wanted there to be more than just the picture on the page. And so he found a good quote for it, and he said he's kind of happy they did that because he thinks that having the quote there's actually in some ways better than what his original idea was. And so it's got a quote from someone who actually watched the Trinity explosion. The very first one, who was at the site on that day. Okay, so now let's take a look at how this works. All Infocom games, I remember this, they kind of had this well that enclosed sort of the important feelies and that stuff. And here is the this like plastic piece that would keep these in place so that they wouldn't fall out, right, or get jostled around too much during shipping or when you handled it. And again, one of the really nice parts about asking Brian for one that was unshrink wrapped is he included this, which I don't know how you get one of these other than just being very lucky, such as I was. This is his actual business card from the day, from back in the day. There's the address of the original Infocom office on an original Infocom business card for the professor himself, which is pretty awesome, and autographed by him, which is just great. I didn't know that was going to be in there. I was so excited to see it. Now, if I actually go ahead and take out the individual pieces in here, the first piece is the sundial construction kit, basically. And you can see that this is effectively like a sundial that you kind of pop out. Like it's cut out, but it's sort of in there, right? It's like, I don't know what you want to call that. And the way that this worked was you would pop these pieces out. And I don't know if you know, there's a gnomon is a thing that the pointy piece of a sundial that casts a shadow, which is this. You pop this out and you insert it in here, and it makes a little paper version of the sundial from from here or in the game. However, it looks like this, but it's in the game as well, obviously. And the sundial itself, represented here, is the same as it is in the game. So these symbols are the symbols that are actually in the sundial in the game. And so you can make your own little sundial, and it has a quote in here from Emily Dickinson, right? You can actually see, which again also features in the game, I believe. Yes, it does. That quote is actually in the game as well, for the actual sundial. And it's got the instructions there on how to do it. It's pretty self-explanatory, but, in case you were wondering. Now this, I guess I don't know if this is too much of a spoiler warning, probably not. It occurs early in the game, in fact. This is instructions on how to fold a origami paper crane. There's nothing on the back, it's just the instructions on the front, as you can see here. And this features very prominently in multiple places in Trinity, as most things do. There's almost nothing in Trinity that only exists in one way. Almost everything in Trinity exists in more than one way. And paper cranes, I won't spoiler why. Some of you who know about the history of atomic weapons and their aftermath probably can already guess some ways in which a paper crane, or why that might be an important symbol in a game about atomic weapons. But if you have never read much about atomic weapons, you may be confused as to why a paper crane is in there. But trust me, it's a fairly important symbol in the history of atomic weapons, and features in very interesting ways in Trinity. It's in actually two separate places, and it's pretty cool both times. Now, this is a folded map that I'm unfolding here now to show you, is the next one. This, I believe, at least according to the professor, and I believe pretty much everyone agrees, this was, at the time it was printed, the only and most accurate map of the Trinity site. It was very hard to find a published map of the Trinity site. The Trinity site, as you can see from this bullseye here, was a detonation site for a test version of an atomic weapon, and there was a house nearby. It was the McDonald Ranch House floor plan. This McDonald Ranch House was, you can see it being pointed to right there, was near the blast radius, and it was the place where the atomic bomb test device for the original Trinity explosion, the very first time anyone had exploded a large-scale nuclear device like that, it was assembled here, in the thing that's called assembly room here. I want to say, and Brian, Professor, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe it was assembled by Richard Feynman himself. Is that accurate? Some folks on the stream may be more familiar with the Manhattan Project than I am, but in this room is where the original nuclear device was actually assembled, before the final assembly took place there. Now, you may wonder, why did Brian include the accurate map? What's the point of all this, right? Well, I don't want to spoiler any parts of the game, so I'll simply say it is relevant to the game. But the other reason was because one of the things that came up very clearly when I was talking to the professor about this was that he cared a lot about the historical accuracy of this game. He was very much like a filmmaker making historical fiction, like James Cameron making Titanic or something, where he was very interested in making sure that all of the things that he represented in the game were faithful to what actually occurred. And so he spent a tremendous amount of time making sure that the Trinity site, as you experience it, is the Trinity site as it was in reality that day, to the best fidelity he could provide, which was no small feat in 1986, when there was no internet and everything had to be researched manually, and very few things had been published about the Manhattan Project comparatively to now. The professor said that there have been much better histories written now that you can read that are easier and more accessible. But at that time, most of this information was actually very hard to come by. Here is the Infocom registration card. Just as today, for some reason, there's this concept of registering with people. I suppose it's to help keep in touch with customers and be able to do direct mail sales. Infocom was no different. You could fill out a form, and you could register your product. And I believe, let me see what it says. Please print clearly and answer all the following questions. Then just mail in this card today, and you'll be reading the official Infocom newsletter, the status line, for free before you know it. Yeah. So if you filled it out, you were then mailed what was called the New York Times. It was a newsletter that Infocom set out to their customers that had, what was happening in Infocom at the time and what new games they're making. The New York Times complained about them using the phrase the New York Times. And so at some point, and I don't remember when, but it's probably easy for you to go look up if you're interested, at some point they changed from being the New York Times to being the status line, and that was just because they basically got threatened by the New York Times. I don't think they were sued. I think they were just kind of cease and desisted, and then we're like, okay. Now, because adventure games are kind of hard to solve because they rely on some sort of arbitrariness, like I said, Infocom, they vary. I think Trinity is actually a pretty fair game. It's pretty fun to solve the puzzles in Trinity. They're not really that bad at all. It's kind of fun to play it, and I think that it's much more well balanced than a typical Infocom game. So it's not a particularly bad offender in this regard, but other Infocom games definitely were. There are plenty of Infocom games where the puzzles are just kind of like, okay, I mean, why was that the solution to this? Come on, right, or whatever. This was an order form for a hint book, because a lot of times people will get stuck on Infocom games, or not just Infocoms, but any of these adventure games. And they would have to get hints, and this is how they would do it. There was also a hint line sometimes that you could call in and ask for hints. I don't know if Infocom had that. Other companies definitely did. But you could order what was called Invisiclues. And Invisiclues was a booklet where you had a special marker that it came with, and you would like rub the marker over the hint you needed, and it would materialize, so that you could only get hints you actually needed and not spoiler other parts of the game you wanted to solve for yourself. So that was an order form for that. Now here's the actual insert for just the Apple Macintosh. This is not particularly interesting because it has nothing to do with Trinity. This is just something that they included for this particular version of the game because I guess they needed additional instructions. I'm not sure why these wouldn't have been in the main manual, but maybe it's because they didn't want to update their manual typesetting to include Macintosh, because Macintosh was a relatively new computer. I don't know. By 1986, it would only have been out for about a year and a half or 2 years when these things were probably had to go to print, would be my guess. So I don't know why it has a special one of these. They probably just got tired of putting them all in the manual, so maybe everything had an insert. Maybe each computer had one. I'm not sure. All right. This I've never seen before. So I'm kind of confused as to what it even is. Interesting. I guess I never had an Infocom game late enough in the series. This is a catalog, basically, of other Infocom games. And I don't remember ever having one of these. I'm sure they had something like this in the earlier ones, but I don't remember it looking like a passport. But yeah, again, not really anything to do with Trinity, but it is sort of like an interesting artifact of what they were selling at the time. You can see Zork 1, 2, and 3 are still sort of things they're pushing, right? What else they got here? Enchanter Trilogy. So that's Enchanter, Sorcerer, and Spellbreaker, for those of you who know what those are. Here's Brian's first game for Infocom. Not his first game ever, but his first game for Infocom, Wishbringer. Which is actually a pretty cool game as well. It's not kind of as amazing as Trinity was, because Trinity is kind of this thing where you're just like, whoa, like how did this happen? But it's a very cool game, and it has a lot of interesting stuff in it. So I actually played it before doing the interview because I wanted to play all his games. So I went back and played them all the games leading up to Trinity. And it's actually a really cool game as well. And I think a lot of people really liked that game. It was a very popular game for Infocom as well. Moon Mist, which I don't think anyone thought was particularly great. I think it's a murder mystery where the outcome changes depending on which color you type in at the beginning. I remember that about it. I never really played that game. Planetfall is there, which of course was a Steve Maretsky, famous Steve Maretsky game. Never played that game, believe it or not. Kind of got some ones that are lower rent here, like they're in this one. These are not in color, so the other ones are in color. It's like a insert. So maybe this was like newer ones. I don't know, but I don't know. These are older ones actually. Like Suspended's pretty old by this point. It's been out for some time. Same with Deadline and Starcross. So I don't know why those are. I don't know why those are not in color. I'm not sure what's going on there. Maybe because they're older. I don't know. Hollywood Hijinks is in there. Leather Goddess of Phobos. Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. Mind Forever Voyaging. Trinity. There it is. Cutthroats, as I mentioned earlier. Ballyhoo. Witness and suspended, and suspect, not suspended. And then some ads for the Invisiclues. Oh, and Fublitsky, which was a game, which is a weird like hybrid computer board game that they did. Finally, you have Quarterstone, which is the weird database program they did that sucked up a lot of Infocom's money and was totally unsuccessful. It was a really unfortunate product for Infocom. And then finally, the last thing in the box. Look at that. An actual old Macintosh decaying disc here with, there it is. It looks like the disc is in good condition anyway. Don't know if it would still read because the magnetism may have kind of gotten old at this point. But there it is. If you've never seen a 3.5-inch floppy before, this is what they looked like. These are not the old kind of floppies. These are actually the newer kind of floppy disk. The older kind were bigger, 5 1/4. They were much larger than this. They were maybe about that big. Were the kinds that were more common. The Macintosh and the Amiga, like the newer computers, were the ones that started using these more compact disks. Presumably because the density on the disks had gotten better, so they didn't need to be as big and could hold more data in a smaller amount of space, right? So it could be a smaller disk. They also did some interesting things with these. If you're interested in this kind of weird history, you may wonder what some of these things are. This is a self-protecting sleeve, basically. So the way that this worked was that older discs, they would look permanently like that, basically. They wouldn't have had a metal piece, the bigger 5 1/4-inch discs. And that part right there is the actual disc on the inside. You can see it here. This is the part that would spin the disc around. Similar to the way a hard disk spins today, right? This was the same kind of concept. It's magnetism on a platter. And it would spin it around, and it would be read by a head that was like moving back and forth on there to read various tracks, basically like a record, honestly. Just magnetism instead of grooves, right? So, you can understand the concept pretty easily. But what it used to be like this. And the problem with that is dust and crap would get in there. So as a result, you had to store all your 5 1/4-inch discs in sleeves. So there would be a sleeve that you would put it in so that it would, and remember it's a bigger disc. It would be like that, right? So that there would be no dust. And you'd take it out of the sleeve to put it in the drive. But this meant you had all these sleeves lying around while you were using discs and had to sit somewhere. The 3 1/4, which is this right here, introduced this sort of self-sleeving mechanism. It's a metal piece that just slides back and forth, so it's spring-loaded so it stays closed when the disk is outside of your computer, and when you inserted it into the disk drive, a little mechanism in the drive would just force it into that position so it could be read. Now, there's another interesting thing, which is up here. Again, another sort of improvement to the disk process over 5 1/4-inch disks. You may be asking, what is this stupid hole in the corner? This hole, I'm honestly wondering how many people on the chat know what this is. Some of you would be like, of course I know what that is. And others are going to be like, I've never seen this object before in my life. This hole in the corner here is the original 5 1/4-inch discs used to have a notch cut in them. And what that notch was is there was a little testing probe inside the drive, a mechanical piece that would see whether in that position it could drop down. If it could, it meant the disk could be written. If it couldn't, it meant the disk was not able to be written. So what this is basically a read-write, like a write-protect flag. You know how in files you can go in and say, read only? This is the mechanical version of that. So in the 5 1/4-inch discs, you just cut a notch in the disk if you want it to be writable, or you left it unnotched if you didn't. And you even had these little weird stickers. I'm not kidding. There were these weird stickers you could get to put back over the notch if you then wanted to turn it back into a read-only disk to prevent it from being written. This is the updated version of that. Instead of having to use a sticker to close it or open it if you want it to be readable or writable, or just having it be solid if the disk is not writable and then notching it manually or whatever, all the kind of bad options. These disks come with a little plastic piece that can be pushed into one of two different positions. So here you can see it's closed, right? Which means the disk, I want to say that's the opposite way. Like, I want to say it's the opposite way that a 5¼ inch one was. Meaning, if it's filled, it means that it can be written. And then if you go in there and you move it so that it's like to the other position, which my nails, I don't know if I actually can. Let me see if I can do that. I need something that I could actually, that's small enough to actually flip it to the other position. There we go. So there, I've moved it to the upper position. Now you can see that you can look right through it, like that. And again, my memory is really bad. Obviously, I would have had to know this back in the day because I used discs like this all the time, but now I've just kind of forgotten. But I believe that if you can see through it, that actually means that now you can't write to it. So I feel like it was kind of the opposite that it was with the other kind of disc. And maybe I'm just misremembering. It seems weird that you would have it that way. Like, it seems like you would want to do it the same way, but I don't know. So I could just be misremembering. Anyhow, I'm going to put all these back in the box as they were when I found them. It's interesting, like the sundial piece is almost too big to fit into the box. Like, that's kind of weird. Like, it's almost like too large. I'm not sure what's up with that. Like, how did that work ever? It's really tightly in there. I guess they wanted it not to move around, because basically they made it in so it only barely fits. I'm going to put the plastic piece back on there. All right. And then we will close it back up. And that is the original Trinity as it existed in 1986. If you had purchased it at the time for one of your home computers, the Mac specifically, but the box was, going to be the same. This is something that they stick on after the fact. This is actually a sticker. You can feel it. So this box would have been the same no matter what one it was. All right.